if a trait stood the test of time because it was necessary to, I'm going to kill you before you kill me, essentially. Well, there's intent there. So there's intent. These traits carry intention.
And what do you think are the biggest patterns of behavior in people with cluster B personality disorders?
Well, I mean, their pathological traits operate around predominantly something known as antagonism. Those traits, unfortunately, with cluster Bs, they're the most interpersonally exploitative because their traits that they have inherent in them are the ones that cause the most problems in the lives of other people. You see the symptoms alleviate, but then the way that they relate to other people doesn't change. That's when you know you're dealing with personality.
So Peter, how do you think it is that they all seem to come to the same handful of strategies?
Well, I would say that is evidence that these are trait-based, behaviors. There's nothing in your genes, anyone's genes, that excuses them from choice and from consequences. But in interpersonal relationships at the extreme end, they just cause problems. They ruin lives. So if you really want to rebuild yourself and just possibly even discover parts of yourself for the first time, now that you have the space to do so, you need to focus solely on what you want. That's it.
Why do some people manipulate, exploit, and cause harm with chilling consistency, while others, even when raised in the same environment, do not? My guest, Dr. Peter Salerno, poses exactly this question in his newest book, Cruelty by Nature: The Science of Intentional Abuse. He's going to dismantle the comforting myth that abuse is strictly the product of trauma or ineffective mothering. Instead, he'll draw from neuroscience, genetics, clinical psychology, and common sense to reveal a sharper truth. Personality pathology is rooted in stable biological systems that bias individuals to exploit other people. In this interview, Dr. Salerno will affirm what many survivors of pathological relationships need to know: that abuse is not an accident. It is often intentional, calculated, and biologically sustained. Ultimately, he is calling for a cultural shift so that healing, justice, and change can finally take root. Dr. Peter Salerno, historically, what do you think has limited our ability to study the intentions of dangerous people?
I think partly my field has contributed a lot to the resistance, because the individuals, will say, who decided that we kind of knew most or everything that we need to know, decided that there's not much intentionality to behavior. A lot of it's unconscious processes and defenses that sort of fuel the engine. And so I think that's been kind of inflated and overemphasized, the risk of completely eliminating the possibility of intentionality. I also think it's just a bit more digestible, palatable, to think that people only react, they never enact cruelty. I think everybody would, sleep better and just be overall happier if that were the case.
Yeah. What do you think are some current advantages that we have in reassessing questions of intentional abuse?
Well, I mean, we have research and we have data from a number of fields, and we have technology, and we have advances that can kind of, in controlled, replicated manners, like show that there are intentions behind things. And I mean, we have an advantage now to study behavior in ways that we couldn't possibly before. We could only speculate. So I think there's a lot of recent research and technologies that allow us to kind of predict and prove things that we couldn't otherwise.
Yeah. And what do you think makes intent so important in the first place?
I think when we introduce the reality of intent, if we're talking about, let's say, intentionally maladaptive behavior, I think if we introduce intent, it informs a lot of people's expectations. I think it helps people understand what's really going on in a relationship dynamic. I mean, there's people, the majority of the people that I've spoken to never even consider the possibility of intent. There's always, this person's wounded, or this person is, defending. Like everybody defends in this way. Nobody does this on purpose. They only react. So I think introducing the possibility that some people are benefiting from certain behaviors, and so they're going to intentionally rely on them, I think that completely, changes expectations and understanding of dynamics.
And when those expectations, that understanding happens, then what happens in the mind of that person who's coming to understand things better?
I think they feel very validated. They feel very relieved. That's typically the feedback unanimously that I've received is once somebody's been able to entertain, the reality that people do benefit from mistreating other people. They don't, it's like this sort of false hope kind of dissipates. And there's sort of just more of realistic understanding and expectations.
Yeah, that validation is huge. One thing that I've noticed, I've looked back at our last interview, so many people will just drop a little comment that just says, I feel so validated listening to this man. It's tremendous for people. I mean, what more is there to that validation?
Well, one of the things that, I think we've talked about a bit in the past is the abuse that results from being in a relationship, right? With somebody who we'll say has a pathological or disordered personality. The more severe ones cause a lot of interpersonal damage. It also causes that cognitive dissonance that I've mentioned. And so that can be alleviated when you start to really see this is pattern strategic behavior, that this person almost plans it at opportune times when they know it's going to hurt the worst or it's going to land, the most beneficial for them. It alleviates a lot of that kind of bewilderment and that this disorienting state that you can remain in where you're just trying to figure out what's real and what's not. And I think a lot of people intuitively know that a lot of this is deliberate, but they don't allow themselves to believe it, or they make excuses because they're trying their best to get the outcome that they want, which is they want things to be collaborative. They want things to work out. They don't want the abuse to be something that's chosen by someone who supposedly says that they love them or they want to work things out. So I think it can alleviate a lot of the dissonance and then that relief and then the validation as well. I think it's pretty powerful how liberating it's been.
Yeah, the dissonance thing may be bigger than it sounds on the surface. You've written a whole book about traumatic cognitive dissonance. What are some of the issues that cognitive dissonance can cause in a person?
Well, I make a distinction between the cognitive dissonance that we all kind of experience day to day. Like we can have cognitive dissonance literally over what we want for lunch, right? Yeah. And it can cause you a degree of discomfort if you really are torn. That's originating in your own mind, though. The kind of cognitive dissonance I'm referring to is not something that happened in your own mind. It's something that's been implanted in you through manipulation. So it's so disorienting and demoralizing because it's almost like somebody invaded you and is now influencing your thoughts and beliefs about what's real and what's not, taking over your perception, hijacking it in a way. So that's that level of cognitive dissonance where it's almost like something gets implanted in you and confuses you and to where you don't know what's real. Devastating. I mean, it's yeah.
And for people who might have a hard time understanding how that can even happen, what causes something like that? Is that gaslighting, other strategies?
Gaslighting is one of them for sure. You can get people to question their reality if you wear them down enough. I think that there are people who are actually pretty skilled at wearing people down in that way. And I think it's sort of like a social strategy. So we can even take the good and evil argument and the good and bad and out the window and just kind of see it for what it is. I don't see it as defense so much as social strategy. I think it's something that really works for these individuals. And those people can make you question your reality.
So we see the value in recognizing intent. What do you think makes narratives about things being out of someone's control, not intentional, those narratives so durable?
Yeah, well, I go into this in my book. I think there's an element of that's wishful thinking, or even magical thinking. That would be ideal, So I think when it comes to intent and social strategy, I think people just wish that wasn't the case, pretty much. I think so. Other things can endure. And once some myth is, popularized, it really never fades away completely,
Yeah, and some of those myths too may be hard to deal with. I mean, one of the myths is that trauma creates this. So there's a grain of truth in that we can see a logic that hurt people. So what's going on with that sort of narrative?
Well, I think it's true that people who are hurt and are wounded, they certainly develop defenses Absolutely. To survive what they've endured and to try to cope with it. So defensiveness can seem really non-collaborative. It can seem aggressive. It can seem even violent emotionally and physically. But when we look at the root of it, what is a defense? It makes sense that this person is perceiving threat. And so they're kind of reacting as a result of that perception.
Abusers, that kind of thing, and that this is a defense.
Yeah. So to a degree, we could say that, people who are defending themselves could potentially get to the point where they're abusive, right? But there's not, then we look at intentionality. There's not an intentionality to that where the person is seeking to be abusive. It's sort of happening. It's not necessarily excused, and it's their responsibility to figure out how to, rein that in. But it's not necessarily intentional, right? But the reality is there are people who have not been mistreated, who grow up to mistreat people in deplorable ways. We even have accounts of certain serial killers reporting that they had a very stable two-parent, household. They had siblings, they had everything that they needed. They were nurtured, they were cared for. They knew they were different from early on, but they didn't really face any adversity that we could pin on those differences. The differences came first. The environment didn't necessarily exacerbate them, but it didn't create them either, right?
Yeah, Peter, you were involved with a Hulu series about Ted Bundy.
Right.
What did Ted Bundy say about this in himself?
He actually said, stop looking for cause and effect because you're not going to find it. And there's confessions of his contradicting himself. Obviously, sometimes he would say, oh, it's this entity in me. And then other times he would say, you're not going to find cause and effect. I don't black out. I don't dissociate. I know exactly what I'm doing. I think society should be protected from people like me. And then, he'll flip it later because that's what they do. And he'll say, it was the sex industry, pornography, which makes people violent. And it's all environmentally, created, and we're all victims of society and all that nonsense. So, but he in moments of clarity and confession basically said he did what he did because he wanted to, and nothing made him, and he didn't want to stop, so he didn't stop.
What about prenatal environment? I've heard the argument that maybe somebody grows up and they don't have much adversity in their childhood, but it must have been something before they were even born.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously the prenatal environment it's a biochemical environment, and a lot can go on that can impact development, across the lifespan. The argument about prenatal environment giving rise to bad behavior, I think a lot of that is inflated. A lot of that research gets inflated, and it's not really possible for a stressful prenatal environment to create like a personality disorder, let's say. There's other factors involved in the development of a personality disorder, but there really isn't anything, there isn't evidence up to this point that suggests that stress alone in that environment could be the cause of a personality disorder. And without that stress, it wouldn't have developed. That's not the case.
Okay. So for ruling that out, and now we're starting to pin down dangerous behavior to cluster B personality disorders, I think. What does make a cluster B personality disorder?
You mean what causes it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, well, you're asking me, so you get it. You're going to get a different answer from me than you would someone else you're interviewing. But
yeah,
I believe that it's really important to emphasize the traits that make up and fuel the kind of operating system of a personality disorder, right? So we're all born with over 400 traits, and there's like 18,000, traits plus that have been identified, psychological, physical, just, human traits. The traits that we have that are the most inflexible are going to be doing the majority of deciding the behavior. Traits are heritable, which means that different people have different degrees of them depending on DNA differences. So I'm sure if somebody described you, they would describe you based on a lot of the traits that they've recognized in you across time. So we're born with traits, and we don't get to decide how much of each trait we're born with. So that's one component to this. And then when we bring our traits into an environment of any kind, just an experiential environment, not an adverse environment or a traumatized one, but when we bring our traits into any environment, what we have a tendency to do, because traits are stable, is we cultivate those traits in the environment. And so we select, modify, create environments that cater to the traits that we bring to the table in the first place. So I would say we have a predisposed trait profile, and then that determines to a large degree how we perceive and respond to environments all across our life, from infancy all the way across our lifespan. I think people with the cluster B traits that we know, with hostility, manipulativeness, antagonism, deceitfulness, grandiosity, risk-taking, perseveration, those types of what are known as pathological traits, those individuals are predisposed to carry those traits into social environments, communicate with them, behave with them. And what we know now about these traits is we kind of grow into them even more as we age. We don't outgrow them. We actually become more of who we are as we get older. So a lot of people will say, well, this personality didn't develop until the person was 21. Or it says, in the DSM that, you see it in early adulthood or adolescence. Well, yes, but one of the reasons for that is because it's more pronounced as people move into different developmental stages. But those traits were always there. Okay, so
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. Let's make sure that I've got this. So we have traits. We could say that they're genetically influenced, and so that's kind of how we show up in the world. And then because that already gets us started on a path, we go looking for environments that work for those traits. We find situations that work for those traits. So if anything, they become amplified through the course of our lives because we're in this feedback loop with the environment that suits our traits.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So knowing all that, and that we have particular traits that could lean people toward a cluster B personality disorder, how predisposed can somebody be to a cluster B personality disorder? How genetically influenced, how heritable is that?
That's a good question. I'd say across the board, just in general population, what we want to consider heritability of traits between 40 and 60% heritable. So in a group of people, the differences in their traits are about 40 to 60% related to genetic differences than the environmental influence or the environmental differences. When we look at twin studies of identical twins raised apart, interestingly, the concordance rates for personality disorders are really high. What that means is, like, if the percentage of the time that the other twin has the same disorder without being in the same environment, right? Just so then you can determine, well, that similarity is based this much on genetics if they weren't brought up in the same environment. And we see the concordance rates for cluster B personalities being pretty high, in the 60 and 70% range. That percentage of the time, one identical twin will have that disorder if the other one does, even if they didn't even know the other existed.
Yeah. So if identical twins born with the same genes are separated at birth, different families, different locations, different upbringing, still 60 to 70% chance that if one has a personality disorder, the other does.
That the other one would too. Yeah. Wow. About 60 to 70% concordant when it comes to personality disorders.
Wow. Yeah. One phrase that I've heard around this sort of idea is that genes load the gun and the environment pulls the trigger. What do you think of that statement?
Yeah, I went over that in my new book a little bit too. It's kind of misleading. It's not that simple. First of all, we have something known as intrinsic developmental variation. What that means is from the moment of conception, you get a mixed bag, right? And then it's a lot of it's like chance. A lot of it's like a lottery. There's a lot of intrinsic variation, meaning not influenced by the environment of any kind, just influenced by the internal environment itself and the internal process of development. There's a lot of things that are going to occur throughout the process of development organically that are going to make people vastly different from one another without the environment, even before they're born, first of all, but also just no social environment necessary. What I think what makes the most sense is, regardless of environmental circumstance, these disorders come from every environment. So that's why we want to really look at genetics is a lot more complex than just you have this profile and then the environment's going to do what it wants with it and create this particular outcome. It's just a lot more complex than that.
So we're establishing huge genetic connection with cluster B personality disorders behavior. What connection is there, if any, between understanding genetics and establishing intent?
Okay, good question. So when I talk about genetics and I talk about DNA, I'm talking about human DNA, first of all. I think people get really hung up when they hear genetic that, oh no, this runs in my family. My family has bad genes. That's not what we're saying here. And we could even go so far as to say it's kind of misleading to say cluster B disorders run in families. What it's more accurate to say is the traits that make up these disorders are run in families because they're part of human DNA. And we have a lot of ancient human DNA. And some of the ancient human DNA passed traits along that stood the test of time because they were necessary for survival. But those traits were pretty brutal, callousness, aggressiveness, hostility, things that to the extreme really, really hurt people. So to understand that means if a trait stood the test of time because it was necessary to, I'm going to kill you before you kill me, essentially. Well, there's intent there. So there's intent. These traits carry intention, right? And there's a reason why they survived over time. And so to study genetics means that we can't deny that there's intentionality to behavior when the very traits that fuel the behavior have intentionality behind them, right?
Yeah. And you're saying before, like kill you before you kill me. It seems there's something to time, anticipation that establishes intent. It's almost a philosophical question.
I think with intention comes a lot of premeditation, fantasizing, thinking, mulling over, right? And everybody that, well, we'll say people who've admitted to stalking or hunting or preying on other people admit to having studied them and following them and seeing, their route and then trying to get information about them that they can mirror back to them for the first encounter. So it seems like there's this stronger connection, this sort of fated connection. That's all premeditated. There's an intentionality behind that. Some people would argue that's completely dissociative process and they're replicating something from early in life, or they're trying to work something out from early in life and they're not fully in control of that. I think there's a lot of social theory that would suggest that. I think that's really irresponsible to think, because it completely gets away from this idea that people might do things intentionally to harm others because it benefits that person. It works for them. That's more important than the harm it causes.
Yeah, and the planning element seems really hard to ignore too. And I've been around one of these people, and at the time I didn't quite realize everything that he was up to, but it was very apparent that he had a systematic approach to people, that he would check them in advance through social media. He would see them in places. He might even try to establish or seed his reputation through others before he would meet them. He would bring his dog places in ways that were not accidental, just to kind of win people over through the dog. I mean, there was a lot of method to the madness. And so we'd say that shows intent.
I would say that's intention. That's absolute intentionality. Now, then other people could argue there's an intent behind it, but it's not fully conscious. Maybe the person feels like they have to do this to cope with something, some deep-seated inferiority or some shame, or maybe this is a defensive strategy that looks like offense, but it's getting activated internally from something that, I mean, those are theories. You could speculate that, but what we can prove is that certain traits give rise to certain specific behaviors because the design of the trait, it's designed, create a certain outcome. So there's a reason behind hostility. There's a reason behind manipulativeness.
Will we always kind of be at that sticking point then around this question? Do you think that, is there something that definitively says this is intent, or will it always sort of have a counterpoint?
That's a good question. I think that it's always going to be, I think it's going to be kind of up in the air.
Yeah. It seems so that there's a set of things that when you look at them together, there's a weight. So there is the planning ahead. There is the patterning. There there's the outcomes. I've talked to people who say it's like they all go to psychopath university and they all seem to have these systems that work for them, and it doesn't really matter who they are. It's much more about what works, and it's what's used over and over. It doesn't seem that all of that could all be chance or unintentional.
I agree.
So what do you think people should watch out for when it comes to the timing element that we talked about?
I think that it would do everyone well to start getting in relationships that are causing you conflict, let's say, or that are feeling unsettling in some way, and you may not be able to put your finger on quite what's going on. Just kind of any dynamic that feels like there's something there that you're not fully aware of. Start noticing, patterns of behavior. Like, I look for enduring patterns of behavior, the way somebody does something more characteristically than occasionally. I think it would be important, because I think when you start to kind of monitor somebody in that way, and you don't have to put a lot of effort into it, it's just noticing things. When you start finding those patterns, you can start predicting things a bit better in the relationship. And so I think, one, it's a safety precaution. I think it keeps you safer day to day, but it also is going to keep you kind of informed of being able to maybe identify things that may have been overlooked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and on a tactical level, what do you think? Journaling, or what have you seen that works for people in kind of checking on these
Yeah.
things?
Yeah. I remember I started when I kind of went through this over now a decade ago. I documented everything, quotes, because I wanted to see. I started really studying the patterns of the interaction to see, was that just said to throw me off, or was there any meaning behind that? Like, I just started kind of questioning a lot of things, and I started creating, a collection. I collected enough data that I could see really interesting patterns of it. I think even intentional contradiction, when they were going to throw a contradictory statement out, it wasn't that they forgot that they said something and so they contradicted themselves. It's that they deliberately contradicted themselves, so that you go, well, wait a minute, but that's not what you said last time. And then now they can weaponize that. So you're calling me a liar, or, whatever. But yeah, so documenting, journaling, because we do have recall bias too as time goes on. So, we might know what happened, but we might not know the exact words. So, paying attention to those details would be important. Keeping a record, keeping a log, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree too. Even for me, after the fact, to digest things, I made a timeline, and I still had records of lots of things: emails, calendar, text messages, things like that. And starting to put things in place did start to help me sort things out. I wonder, for you, was the question of intent particularly useful? How did it affect you?
Personally, that was my saving grace.
Yeah.
I it was interesting because I was conceptualizing what was happening to me through the lenses of trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, this person is so brutally traumatized that they can't help themselves, you know? And then, interestingly, I had to get continuing education credits for my license. And so I was looking for different trainings to attend. And I had found this one by George Simon, who wrote In Sheep's Clothing. And it was about manipulators. And I was like, well, that's a really bold name for a training. Like, we're just going to talk about manipulative people. And so I was curious, and I attended his training, and then I just immersed myself in his books, because he was he was the first person in my field that I heard say, some of these people have this sincere conviction that they are superior to others, and they're not compensating for anything. I was like, I had some cognitive dissonance even right there. I was like, wait a minute, what? I couldn't have read that right. And then he started saying that a lot of these behaviors that are manipulative are conscious and deliberate. And I was like, no way. There's no way somebody would do that offensively. I could see why they would do it defensively. It really shook my world and my worldview in a very profound way. I think also saved my life, saved my skin.
Yeah. Well, and what a strategy. I mean, for someone like you who's trained to want to help somebody work through their trauma, work through their empathy, that kind of thing, to then go to you and show that they're somehow wounded and have so much trauma and need your help. I mean,
Yeah.
it's targeted to draw you in.
Absolutely. Agreed.
Yeah. One thing that comes up with this sort of topic is that maybe this somehow would negate the impact of trauma on people, or negate those who are actually acting out of a place of trauma. What do you think of that?
No, absolutely not. Trauma speaks for itself as how impactful it is. This isn't an argument of either or. I did just have a conversation recently with a colleague, and they were discussing, do you think a personality disorder can develop in extreme cases of trauma without the genetic influence? Or, like just kind of from the ground up, like could we create a personality disorder from the way we treat someone? There's so many problems with that question, because we would have to define trauma, we would have to define severity, we would have to, define all those factors, and then we would have to define personality disorder. But I think people can be absolutely destroyed by trauma. The question is, when somebody is traumatized and they're behaving in ways that hurt other people, are they fully conscious of it, or is it a defense? So no, I mean, the trauma is never going to be negated in these discussions if we really talk about it properly. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it seems there's a real difference too in what we see people react to trauma with and what say a cluster B personality disorder looks like. I mean, for you as a professional, I mean, what would you say are common severe trauma responses, and how do those compare to personality disorders?
Good question. So something often that gets misconstrued, in not only in clinical literature, but in popular media, there's been these discussions about borderline personality disorder and complex PTSD. And this is a long going, there have been multiple proposals to try to rename or reclassify BPD as complex PTSD or a complex trauma disorder and remove it as a personality disorder. There's been proposals to that. They constantly get rejected. And the reason why is because the proposals are confusing risk with causation. Okay. They're saying that the risk factors that contribute to complex PTSD are the same things that cause BPD. That's not true. So there might be emotional dysregulation common in both disorders. There might be some emotional numbing. There might be some, unproductive escalations, but there's also other components related to BPD that are absent in complex PTSD. And that's why we have to differentiate. And those ones are related to the traits that we've been talking about. Those are behaviors and tendencies are trait-based. They're trait-related. They're not experiential or environmentally influenced. And so we have to make a distinction that a trauma disorder is, chronic stress in the nervous system is what a trauma disorder causes. That is not what a personality disorder is. A personality disorder is not chronic stress in the nervous system. No.
Peter, you said that there would be traits associated with borderline personality disorder different from, say, symptoms of severe trauma. What are those traits, just to make the distinction?
So in the DSM and the alternative model or the dimensional model of personality, where it focuses on the severity of the traits that are characteristic of these disorders, in borderline, we see something known as negative affectivity, right? And so we see like sort of a bias toward negativity and a bias toward perceiving others as perceiving them negatively. And so this is trait based. It's not experiential. It gets activated by the environment because the person will start wondering if you're judging them or you're criticizing them or you're planning on leaving them. And so they get really suspicious of you. But it's not activated by the trauma. It's activated by, these deficiencies in the traits that make up the disorder.
So, Peter, it would seem that if a personality disorder could be caused by trauma, then you're a trauma therapist. Could you treat the underlying trauma and make the personality disorder go away?
No, trauma interventions do not make personality disorders go away. One, because trauma treatment alleviates symptoms, and we're not talking about symptoms with personality disorders. We're talking about a characteristic way of being. So it's not something that comes up at like a symptom, like an example of a symptom of PTSD, a trauma condition, is flashbacks. People have flashbacks or they have nightmares, recalling vividly the traumatic event, almost like they're reliving it. Okay, that's a symptom. So the trauma intervention would want to successfully target that symptom to reduce it, and then eventually eliminate the flashbacks and the nightmares. That's something that happened as a result of environmental experience. You got those flashbacks because of something that happened in your environment. You weren't born that way, right? If you take trauma symptoms out of an individual with a personality disorder, they still have those stable traits. So I've treated people successfully who had comorbid PTSD and also a personality disorder. And then once you eliminate the trauma symptoms, what actually ends up happening is the personality disorder comes out even more, right? Because now they're no longer budgeting energy dealing with the trauma symptoms. Because I'm not denying these people can get traumatized and they can be traumatized. We're not saying that they're immune to trauma. We're just saying that's not the full story. That's not the complete picture. We can't stop there.
What does that look like? I'm imagining a grandiose narcissist who then has post-traumatic stress disorder, and then their sort of narcissistic, larger-than-life energy is something that they're not so much able to tap into, and then when the trauma is treated, then they can tap back into that?
It's almost like the trauma is, it requires energy, right, to deal with. And so when you are experiencing those symptoms and they're intruding upon you, it's going to dampen down some of the other things that might be a little bit more apparent that we're more attended to. And so I worked with quite a few people that had a personality disorder and then a PTSD related to work, like an environment, first responders and things like that, people who get really traumatized at work. And one individual that I worked with, he was recalling a call that he had gone on where he lost some of his crew. And he was having nightmares about that, and he was seeing, their demise, and he couldn't get that out of his head. And he was really soft-spoken, and he was really, still kind of charming, but sort of like in a passive way. And then we did EMDR successfully on those images that were intruding, and he felt a lot of relief, and his sleep disturbances went away. But then the focus of treatment shifted drastically by his request. And it started to be revealed just how grandiose and inflated and really not interested in other people's needs or wants or desires, was kind of underneath the surface of that tension. Yeah. So it's not like you can't even use an intervention for trauma to tap into anything related to a personality disorder, because the causes are completely different. And that's why the treatment is completely different.
So, I mean, this seems to really debunk the trauma argument for the development of personality disorders in the first place. If treating trauma doesn't treat the personality disorder, how could it be a trauma issue?
One argument that I get in response to that is, well, first of all, you're assuming that everybody knows what their traumas are. Yeah. So maybe these traumas that maybe you can't treat the trauma because they're unconscious or they're inaccessible. It's not that they didn't happen. Again, that's a clever theory because you can't disprove it or prove it because it's unconscious, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying it's not, you can't prove it. But that's typically what I hear. But the reality is you see the symptoms alleviate, but then the way that they relate to other people doesn't change. That's when you're dealing with personality.
So at this point, we've talked about this intention question around a lot of things: the environment, genes, trauma. Brain anatomy is something that you and I have touched on a little bit in the past. What are some of those brain anatomy differences? And then maybe we can get into how that might relate to intention.
There have been noticeable structural and functional differences in volume and matter in the brain, depending on the disorder, and not just personality disorders, but all kinds of psychopathology shows up on brain imaging. All that is to say, those differences that give rise to some of the deficits or abnormalities, we can say, they're there from the start, meaning they were developing intrinsically regardless of environmental experience. There are environmental experiences that can also alter the structure and function of the brain. We can certainly do that. We see that. But then there are also people that are literally wired differently from the beginning. And again, this isn't just exclusive to personality. I mean, we see this even now. There are what are known as gene copy number variations that can determine autism, schizophrenia, things like that, just from the kind of genetic mosaic, the kind of the lottery, and then that informs the development of the brain too. So all that is to say, there are documented changes and differences that seem to be there from the start.
So how would differences in the brain structure of a person with, say, a cluster B personality disorder drive their intention?
Well, because those differences give rise to how the nervous system is communicating, how sensory systems are communicating. Everything is connected. So if there's a deficit in a region, or if there's an area of the brain, let's say, that's like considered very necessary for the capacity for empathy, and that's impaired either because it was damaged, like through a brain injury, or it was never really developed optimally from the start. There was a structural difference. That's going to inform intention. That's going to inform perception. That's going to inform everything. So the way our brain functions absolutely is directly related to how intentional something is, how defensive something is. We know that brain scans have revealed structural and functional differences in brains with people who have what are known as callous unemotional traits. And so they're not neurotic enough. They're not anxious enough because of their brain is wired in a way where they don't get those signals to get worked up about something, which then gives rise to this sort of fearlessness and callousness where there's no fear learning. They keep doing these same things over and over again because there's no consequences to them emotionally. Their brains reward them for that. So the physical structure, the organ of the brain is going to also tell us a lot about intentionality versus defensiveness.
And Peter, it seems a lot of this is about empathy. Something that you've highlighted in your most recent book is a difference between cognitive empathy and affective empathy. So people often say, oh, these people, they lack empathy. And yet it seems that they are also, some of them can function like incredible mind readers.
Right.
So what's going on there? What's that distinction?
Yeah. Well, and even splitting cognitive and affective down the middle and creating, treating them as completely separate, it's kind of misleading. It's sort of a metaphor, but yeah, I mean, there's different expressions and experiences of empathy. Certainly there's an understanding of empathy. Like you can understand why somebody might be worked up or upset about something. That's different than actually being attuned to it and having an emotional response to it, right? So, but what we know about these individuals who do a lot of mirroring and mimicking of empathy, what we know about them is they are cognitively aware that what they are doing is wrong or harmful or dangerous or detrimental to somebody else. What's lacking is the capacity to put themselves in the other person's shoes emotionally, to then be able to say, if this were happening to me, it would be really unpleasant, and I'm going to avoid doing that. That never really comes online with these individuals. That's really what's missing.
Yeah. So how does that relate then to the orchestration of behavior with these dual mixed forms of empathy?
Well, so basically empathy and other traits too, compassion, humility, understanding, these things help people, these things inform people's behavior. Yeah. They do. People who have those traits have a tendency to be able to get in touch with like an internal, George Simon calls it an internal brake pedal, where you put on the brakes. Even if you wanted to do something harmful, you have enough window to kind of pause and say, oh, I don't really know if I'm going to like the consequences, or I don't really know if I'd like something like that happening to me, so I'm not going to act that way. There's an intentionality to that you can master, if you cultivate that and practice that a lot. With individuals that inflict intentional harm, they have the opposite. Those things don't occur. What occurs is something telling them to keep going because this is what you want. That's all that matters. Go gratify it. And
so Peter, how do you think it is that they all seem to come to the same handful of strategies?
Well, I would say that is evidence that these are trait-based, behaviors, because they're human traits. And so the people that have them at these extreme degrees, or the people that have the extreme deficits, are the ones who are behaving identically. They're behaving in the same strategic, precise ways, regardless of environment. Globally, these have been identified.
Yeah. And what do you think are the biggest patterns behavior in people with cluster B personality disorders?
Well, I mean, their pathological traits operate around predominantly something known as antagonism, where they put people at odds with one another. They see things as a competition. They provoke. They literally antagonize. And then underneath that domain are all kinds of other things: deception, manipulation, impulsivity, not learning from consequences, hostility, risk-taking, all of those things that you would see in the categorical diagnostic checklists and that those traits. Unfortunately, with cluster Bs, they're the most interpersonally exploitative because their traits that they have inherent in them are the ones that cause the most problems in the lives of other people.
One of those strategies is something called reality distortion, which I
Mhm.
hadn't seen other people write about, but you've written about. What is reality distortion?
Intentional, um, it's an intentional strategy on the part of a manipulative person to get a victim to start questioning what's real and what's not
Hmm.
in all cases, like what was said, what was heard, what was done, so that essentially people, if a socially predatory person can keep you in a state of ambiguity or dissonance, then they're pretty much owning you. And that's why they do reality distortion, because that's one of the ways that they keep you confused, is by you no longer knowing what's real for you and what's not.
Yeah. Yeah. Another context that I actually heard this phrase used in is
Mhm.
in the biography of Steve Jobs. And they said that Steve Jobs had a reality distortion field, as though he could kind of just make people around him believe that they could pull something off, even though it seemed disconnected from reality. What do you think about this kind of behavior in business? Does business make people like this?
I think people gravitate towards certain things because they have those propensities. I
Mm,
think, so I think it's probably it's common in that arena, let's say,
yeah.
because a lot of those people with that capability probably gravitate towards that. I also want to say this, and I don't want this in any way to sound like I'm not recognizing the damage that these traits cause. But if we look at these traits from an evolutionary perspective, we see that there was some utility in them. There was something that was of use at some point. The problem is now what we've collectively decided is a cooperative, collaborative, kind society that we want to live in. Those things no longer work according to the new standards that we are trying to hold. And so my point of that is to say that some of these traits can seem very useful, like in business or in politics or in organizations that are big, where people need to be able to handle a lot of stress without burning out or not, getting too rattled, making important decisions like that. So there's a usefulness in them, but in interpersonal relationships at the extreme end, they just cause problem. They just, they ruin lives. So
One thing that people talk about in these relationships is a sense of justice.
Mhm.
What do you think that these findings about a person being sort of wired to be cruel would say about finding justice, holding that person responsible?
Well, are we talking about legal justice?
And it could be.
I unfortunately tell people there's usually not legal justice or
Yeah.
fairness in
Yeah.
these situations yet, anyway. I don't think we're anywhere close to getting to the point where people are going to be held accountable for their traits and there's going to be any justice. Not anytime soon. We're still stuck in the past of the only type of abuse that exists is if there's physical marks on the skin. So but as far as just justice for what happened to somebody, I think that you're going to have to create an internal justice that works
Mm.
for you, because it's probably not, most of the time, it's not going to happen outside there in the
Yeah.
justice system.
Yeah. What does that internal justice look like?
I mean, what it looked like, I can say what it looked like for me, and then I wrote about it in one of my books because I thought it was a concept worth sharing. What it looked like for me is having no negative emotional charge to the facts of the story, the reality, the experience. It's just has absolutely no power over the person whatsoever anymore. I think it's not an apathy, but it's more like a benign kind of indifference where you can look at it, remember it, and you don't feel anything either way. Like, it's not enough to upset you, nor is it enough to make you not care. I think that's justice because there's no conquered it.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That lack of charge seems to be a key factor there because, of course, if you have one of these relationships, you're going to look back on it and you're going to have a judgment of the situation. You're going to
Hmm.
think things about it. But to be able to reflect on it and not get worked up, that seems to be more the idea.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what about seeing that person too? I mean, is there something to being able to be around them? Is it something people should think about? Is it avoid at all costs? I've heard you say that going no contact doesn't necessarily resolve the trauma bond, so that's not necessarily
Yeah.
enough.
Well, I mean, because what what we carry from that person is not whether or not they're in proximity, but it's in here now. It's in your nervous system. I think it's sort of like a case by case basis. I think if you're somebody who can tolerate, like let's say you're living in the same area or whatever, or you have to commingle because you have commingled business or kids or whatever, and you can't not ever see them again. I think there's probably ways to build a resilience to that so that it's not problematic for you. But I would say ideally, if the person isn't going to be contributing anything meaningful to your life and you don't have to see them, I don't see why you would want to or should. But I think also some people feel good about the reality that they can cross paths and they don't feel unnerved anymore. I think that's something to be, you know, that would be a great accomplishment.
Maybe there's some spite or something in that too that can be exciting. So to get the tune down thing,
Mhm.
how do people get there to that state of internal justice?
Things that I've seen work really well to do that are some trauma therapies with people who with practitioners who are aware of this kind of pathological type of abuse that you can be coerced into, your reality can be distorted. So I've seen like trauma interventions like eye movement therapies, EMDR, things like that. I know a lot of people benefit from reality testing in like support groups where they know somebody's going to validate them and they're not going to say, well, maybe you should have known or done this or whatever. So that validation and that people believing you because they've experienced it too, I think is very powerful, very healing. I think, telling your story, right, I think that's very useful. All these things can eventually over time collect interest, if you will, and kind of create a systemic kind of relaxation where you might not even see it coming. One day you just don't get activated as much as you thought you were going to, and kind of it surprises you like, wow, I noticed the change, I noticed the shift. But it's certainly possible. So
Knowing this, all of this that we talked about, if it's in somebody's genes, if they're kind of born this way, does this strip them of responsibility for what they do to people?
no, absolutely not. There's nothing in your genes, anyone's genes, that excuses them
Mm,
from choice and from consequences. There's not even things that are excused. You don't even excuse things that are out of people's control that they do. There's still consequences for people doing things under the influence. There's still consequences for people doing things when they're experiencing psychosis. So, and these aren't disorders that impair people's reality in the sense of they're not out of touch with reality the way somebody who's psychotic is, right? So these people are absolutely culpable for their behavior. Predisposition isn't the same thing as predetermination, right? And so even if you have a propensity to want to do something, you still have to go and do it, right?
mhm.
I think people would disagree with me. Other people would say, no, that's an unconscious process. We're not as in control of it as you're suggesting. However, you can practice getting better at something. You can practice getting better at impulse control, for example, right? Even if you have a tendency to be highly impulsive, it's still your choice what you're going to do with that.
If a person lacks empathy, what about maybe an inability to even recognize suffering in others?
Yeah.
Would that prevent them from even getting into a feedback loop where they would know to change their behavior?
Yeah, it wouldn't come online. Like it wouldn't register
Mm,
that there's something that needs changing.
yeah, yeah. So if the person doesn't even register it, I mean, we're getting into philosophy now, but if it doesn't register for them, are they still responsible for something they maybe don't even know is wrong?
Well, I would say once you correct it,
Okay, so when they get a feedback from
well,
another
like
person?
I mean, I think, yeah, we're getting into philosophy here.
Yeah, I think so.
I don't know. It's kind of like children, right? Children they push the envelope.
Yeah.
They test the waters.
Yeah.
They get reprimanded or told like, no, now we got to operate within these limits. They get frustrated about it. The ones that are more flexible kind of use that as a useful strategy, the flexibility. Okay, we can't get everything we want in life, right? They work that out. I think it's kind of the same thing with adults. Like that's why we have parameters and rules and things. And one, they're supposed to prevent things in the first place, but they also are supposed to enforce consequences in the event that someone violates them. So I do believe people, I mean, we're not 100% free. We don't have 100% free will. We have automatic systems that do a lot of things for us, whether we like it or not, in our body. But I think we have enough agency that we don't, unless it can be proven that it's like something that's so compulsive that's the person can't stop. They need to be responsible.
Peter, there's a word that you come back to a lot today, and that's traits. I think people
Uh-huh.
often get hung up on the idea of red flags
Mhm.
or something that's sort of more like particular. What traits really can people look for, and what should they do if they recognize a few traits in someone?
Well, that's a good question. I have in the appendix of my new book, I actually have I have one section where I go over all of the pathological traits, right? So the trait and the definition of the trait and kind of how it shows up in a relationship. And then I also have sort of like an assessment that you can kind of ask some questions that could help you kind of narrow down if you're dealing with somebody who's only kind of causing conflict when in a sort of a symptomatic way, you know, like when there's, let's say, good reason to, or if there's an enduring and pervasive pattern of behavior, right? And so I have a kind of a little informal screening tool there that will help people identify the traits and then also kind of see how often is this occurring in this context, and you can kind of start to get clear on what you're dealing with.
Yeah. And there's another line in there that you said, dangerous personalities do not heal through empathy, they exploit it.
Yeah.
So for the very empathetic person who wants to check in on somebody who seems to be acting out, what suggestions?
Well, are you saying what to do in the event that you're dealing with someone who doesn't have empathy?
If you see these traits,
Yeah.
but like we talked about children, you're the kind of person who would kind of want to see them as the hurt child and you want to check in on them. What advice do you have for that person, maybe to slow them down before they expose themselves if empathy is something that gets exploited?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, you're going to have to see empathy as something that you reserve depending on the person. It's not something you should wear on your sleeve, I don't think.
Yeah.
But I would say you're going to also have to start realizing that not everybody is built the same on the inside. Like, so you can't assume that taking care of someone with empathy and compassion is going to produce a universal effect. I mean, there are people who get more exploitative when they're empathized with because they take advantage. So get clear on the kind of person you're dealing with, I guess, before you give all of that away so freely.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think is the best protection from dealing with dangerous people in the first place?
That's a difficult question because I believe people who are highly intelligent and competent and capable and have a good gut instinct and good intuition can still be manipulated. You know, there's people who are really good at manipulating. I guess one thing that you can be certain won't ever be a bad thing and won't ever not work out is to take your time, you know,
Mm,
with people. Just go slower than you normally would. Uh, like a steady pace of letting someone reveal themselves to you,
yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
Tho These people love the intensity of the beginning, and they try to hook you right away, so if you're right there, if you feel like this is moving with what seems like something really wonderful, but it's at this fast pace and it's really intense, there's not really any reason for that, so that would typically I'd want people to kinda slow down if that's what they're experiencing.
Well, Dr. Peter Salerno, before we get to our last topic, where should people look for you online?
I'm on, Instagram and YouTube at Dr. Peter Salerno. and I have some books on Amazon. That's my latest one, Cruelty by Nature. And my website, drpetersalerno.com. I offer workshops and co-facilitate support groups, and I also offer individual consultations for people trying to just get some education on what they're dealing with.
We'll put some links in the description for people to check out. And Peter, the last thing is really that when you go through a relationship like this, it affects your whole sense of identity for a lot of people. What do you think people can do after one of these relationships to start restoring their identity, exploring their identity?
So it's funny, this question has come up a lot lately. I tell people, and there's a lot of resistance to this in the beginning because people feel like it's selfish. But I actually think if you really want to rebuild yourself and just possibly even discover parts of yourself for the first time now that you have the space to do so, you need to focus solely on what you want. That's it. Like, that's one of the first steps, is focus entirely on what you want. And like in a sky's the limit kind of a way. The reason why is because for some reason, allowing yourself to unapologetically just admit to what it is that you would want in life, you get to know yourself really well. And so I would really encourage people to do that for self-rebuilding or even self-discovery, is to just get really clear on what it is that you want.
Would there be maybe steps after that, once people kind of get in touch with that?
Well, then go do those things.
Execution, yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I think you can rebuild yourself through also reparative, attuned relationships, find good support, get people, you have the correct, what we call it, the corrective emotional experience in relational therapy, where the therapist is hopefully supposed to provide you with an experience that is emotionally correct for you, that fits and that's validating. You need to find friends and other relationships where that can be cultivated, because you will start to get in the habit of recognizing when that's not present. And also you develop, like, you lose your immunity to the manipulation. It becomes intolerable even in small doses. So I would say, yeah, put yourself first, go after what you want, cultivate that, execute that, find a support system where you're having correct emotional experiences with people. And then, all the other kind of self-care stuff that people know to do, but they often say they don't have enough time for.
Yeah. Yeah.
Take care of yourself, take care of your body, all of that.
Yeah. And that part about people that you're around and how they affect you, that really rings true with my own experience too. Peter Salerno, thank you so much for being one of those people, for introducing me to a number of people and professionals who I've had on the show since, for your books, and for taking this interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching my interview. If you want to go even deeper into these ideas, you can watch my previous interview with Dr. Peter Salerno on the genetic origins of personality disorders. You can find links to that interview and everything else we discussed in the description.